The post-war era dawned with even more problems than at the outset of the war. The peace established at Versailles was flawed, and without its chief enforcer, the United States, soon was rendered powerless. Meanwhile, a new government rose up in Russia and would soon occupy the minds and psyches of numerous leaders, their nations, and their peoples. And nationalism was now unleashed throughout the world as the old empires crumbled and the colonial empires shuddered. Here you see a map of Europe during the post-war period. France now having had Alsace and Lorraine restored to it. Germany having been trimmed back quite a bit. New nations emerge. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. Romania grows. Greece gets its independence from Turkey once again. You notice that Russia has been pulled far back into the area of Belarus. Asia is also heavily affected by the First World War, although the colonial empires remain partially in force here. While the Germans lost many of their islands in Polynesia, the colonial powers of the Dutch, the British, and the French still maintain their strongholds in India, Vietnam, and Indonesia. The new Republic of China, which had been established in 1911, now is growing in size. And while Japan and its foothold in Korea do not look all that large, it nonetheless poses a grave threat. Down at the lower left-hand side of your picture, your map, you see that there is one colonial empire that I have not yet addressed, and that's the Philippines, which is, of course, controlled by the United States. Like a thorn in the side of the Japanese, the issue of the Americans in the Philippines is going to pose serious issues for the Japanese as they expand westward and southward into Asia. The colonial empires of Africa also remain pretty much intact. As you see, the great French possessions that take over much of Western Africa and Northern Africa and the Sahara region. You have Angola and Mozambique as part of the Portuguese Empire, the British Empire, of course, with numerous possessions like the Sudan and South Africa and so forth. You see the areas that the Germans have lost as a result of this war: Cameroon, Tanganyika. You see now Egypt now being groomed, so to speak, for independence. And let's not forget, never forget, the Middle East. From the old Ottoman Empire came the independent Republic of Turkey that would declare its own independence. France took over a mandate in Syria as well as Lebanon. The British had a mandate in Palestine and also the British mandate of Mesopotamia, which would later become known as the nation of Iraq and Kuwait. You have the independent kingdom of Saudi Arabia that is formed after the war. And of course, you have Iran, which is an independent nation and a kingdom that stretches way, way, way back, even before the time of Christ. If you look at the map of Iraq that you see there, especially in the northern and the eastern parts, those borders are drawn based on oil fields rather than on national boundaries, because where French Syria and British Mesopotamia and the southeastern corner of Turkey and the northwestern corner of Iran all come together, that's Kurdistan. And those people had been clamoring for their independence as well, and they would not get it. The peace at Versailles was very harsh. Now, it was not as harsh as, say, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was to the Russians that the Germans brokered. Nonetheless, it had many people wondering why they would want to be so vindictive toward Germany. Lloyd George felt that some of the provisions would cause instability. Remember, you have to think about long-term consequences. Marshal Foch said that this was simply an armistice for 20 years. He would prove almost prophetic in that. Colonel Edwin House, who had been left out of the Versailles negotiations after Wilson came to Europe and then split with the president, said the Versailles Treaty is not that bad and not that good. There's much to approve, and much to regret. John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, the one who talks a great deal about in times of depression and so forth, recession, that the government should take a role in spending more money to reinvigorate the economy. Keynes wrote that Versailles was a Carthaginian peace. What he means by that is he goes back in ancient times to the Punic Wars when Rome finally defeated Carthage. They destroyed Carthage and then sowed salt in the fields to end the Carthaginian Empire. Many non-white populations, especially the Japanese, were left after Versailles feeling rather ignored and disrespected. And remember, the Japanese have very long memories. The United States itself failed to ratify the treaty and did not join the League of Nations. The reparations that were demanded of Germany and the Central Powers, which could be paid in cash, but it could also be paid in kind through restorations or through equipment and so forth. Well, because Germany was so hamstrung with their reparations, this threatened the economies of all European countries, because you see that the European economy is beginning to become more and more interwoven. The other treaties that later are signed are also harsh and totally unworkable. And so you have peace on paper, and you have penalties on paper, and yet nobody's willing to enforce it. In order to understand what happened in Russia, and still is happening in Russia today, one really should begin with Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known by his alias, Lenin. Lenin was a Russian revolutionary, a politician, and he was a political theorist. He served as the first and founding head of government, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, starting back in 1917. He was not born in poverty. He came from very middle class upbringing. His childhood picture shows a level of prosperity for his family. His ethnic origins remain unclear, although there are suggestions made that he was of Russian, Chuvash, Mordvin, and Kalmyk ancestry, and one can see that Kalmyk Asian root in his eyes. Lenin embraced revolutionary socialist politics following his brother's 1887 execution. He took to Marxism, moved to St. Petersburg in 1893. There he became a senior Marxist activist. In 1897, he was arrested for sedition by the Tsar's secret police and exiled for 3 years, then moved to Western Europe. After the failed Russian Revolution of 1905, he campaigned for the First World War to be transformed into a European-wide proletarian revolution. And he believed the revolution would cause the overthrow of capitalism and its replacement with socialism. When the February Revolution broke out in 1917, the Tsar was ousted, and a new provisional government was established. Lenin then returned to Russia in a sealed train car arranged by Ludendorff and the Germans, and led the October Revolution that overthrew the new regime. Lenin was more interested in revolutionizing Russia along Marxist principles than he was about carrying on the war. So he decided to accept the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and its very harsh penalties, conceded territory to Germany, and promoted world revolution through what is known as the Communist International, or the Comintern. He would be brutal. He would suppress opponents through the Red Terror, killing thousands or interning them in concentration camps. His administration defeated right and left-wing anti-Bolshevik armies in the Russian Civil War from 1917 to 1922. He then oversaw the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921. With his health failing, Lenin died in Gorky in January 1924 at the age of only 53. There are some that say he was poisoned, but a later autopsy proved that he was suffering from serious sclerosis, hardening of the arteries. When the revolution broke out in Russia, Lenin was in Switzerland. Through negotiations with the Germans, Lenin and 200 of his followers got on a sealed train. That meant it made no stops along the way, and went all the way to the Baltic Sea. Then they all crossed by ferry to Sweden, got back on a train, and went all the way around the Gulf of Bothnia, down into Finland, and then landed in Petrograd, which is St. Petersburg, where Lenin immediately started taking part in the revolution. There you see the last known photo of the now deposed Tsar, Nicholas II. He was with his family near the town of Ekaterinburg in 1918. Ekaterinburg is in the Ural Mountains. There was a Russian civil war going on at the time, and the Tsar's family could have been targeted by what were known as the Whites in the Russian Civil War, who wanted to reinstall him. Under guard and control by the Reds, they eventually would murder him and his entire family, including his daughter Anastasia, despite what all the stories say. Please understand something. The Russian Revolution was not the caliber of the French Revolution when it came to changing things all over. It merely replaced one group of leaders, the Tsar and his cronies, with another group of leaders, Lenin and his cronies. There was no major upsurge like the French Revolution, although there were some upsurges cosmetically. But the Russian Revolution of 1917 is actually two revolutions. The first one was the February Revolution. This is the one that overthrew the Tsar. This is when all the riots started breaking out in the streets. The Tsar realized that he couldn't control it anymore and that he might be in trouble, and so he abdicated his throne. This led to a provisional government being led by Alexander Kerensky. Kerensky is a democratic style of politician. He wanted to create a parliamentary style of government based on the European model. But the provisional government was very weak and was unable to hold its authority or gain any mandate from the people, and the revolutions continued. So in October, you had what was known as the Bolshevik Revolution. And the Bolsheviks are the Marxist communists who are led by Lenin and a cadre of other people. It's not just Lenin in this. Now, what the Russians had established were what were known as Soviets. Soviets are local councils or assemblies in Russia that elected delegates to a Congress, and then this Congress would meet and pass legislation. On the Soviet level, that is the small s Soviet level, there is a great deal of democracy. But eventually these Soviets are going to be purged of anybody who's not a Bolshevik. That's the problem. And that is the work of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin. He seized power in 1917, in November of 1917. And we do know that the execution of the Tsar and his family on July the 16th, 1918, came on orders from Lenin. He did not want the Tsar to be captured by the Czech soldiers that were along the Trans-Siberian Railroad who were looking to get him out of Russia and then set up a government in exile. And so they executed the Tsar and his family, and the bones actually were not found until much, much later. Now, as Lenin only ruled the Soviet Union for 7 years, one of the up-and-coming members of Lenin's cadre was a fellow by the name of Stalin. And Lenin did not want Stalin to be his successor. But nonetheless, Stalin did succeed him as the preeminent figure in the Soviet government after his death. Once the Bolsheviks take over in Russia, this initiates the Russian Civil War. On one side are the Reds. They are the Bolsheviks, the communists. They carried out what was known as the Red Terror, the elimination of Bolshevik opponents. On the other side were the Whites. They were anti-communist. They were supported by the Allied nations, France, England, Czechoslovakia now. They carried out the slaughter of Bolsheviks called the White Terror. Eventually, the Bolsheviks would win the Civil War, despite the help of some of the Allies. They would establish the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922. It would last until 1991. That's 69 years, folks. It was a highly centralized state and a highly centralized economy. They moved the capital from St. Petersburg, which is now called Leningrad, to Moscow. Now, in the Soviet Union, there are two major sects in the Communist Party. There is one that is very ideological. That's led by Leon Trotsky. They want to spread the revolution all over the world. On the other side are those that want to say, okay, we'll spread the revolution, but later, let's consolidate first. They, of course, are led by Stalin. This map shows the Russian Civil War, the areas controlled by the Bolsheviks in gold and the areas controlled by Allied troops in the green. To the north around Murmansk and Archangel, this is where American troops actually fought on Russian soil for a while. Meanwhile, the forces of the Allies also fought in the south in the Caucasus, which is where Azerbaijan is located, Armenia is located, Georgia is located. Leon Trotsky was born Lev Davidovich Bronstein. He was the fifth child of a Ukrainian Jewish family. Like many revolutionaries, he spent time in Siberia and made numerous friends and comrades among his fellow revolutionaries before he escaped. Like many revolutionaries, he spent time in exile and made numerous friends and comrades among his fellow revolutionary exiles, including Lenin. He helped organize the failed Russian Revolution of 1905 and went again to Siberia and again escaped. He became active again during the Russian Revolution, and he is the one who helped arrange the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He later would come to clash with Stalin over the direction of the USSR before being exiled for the last time. He traveled mostly through Central and South America, spreading his gospel of communism, before he was assassinated in 1940 in Mexico City with an ice axe by a Spanish NKVD agent, thus ending the role of Trotsky. If you've ever read the book Animal Farm, the pig named Snowball is based upon Trotsky. The other pig in the book Animal Farm is, of course, Napoleon, and he is the one who is based upon the character Stalin, the one person Lenin did not want to see succeed him in charge of the Soviet Union. His name was Yosef Vissarionovich Zhukashvili. Once again, in the tradition of notable rulers, the man who became known as Stalin was not originally from the country he ruled, just like Napoleon, just like Alexander the Great. He was born in the Russified state of Georgia to a brutal alcoholic father and a mother who doted on him. He was scarred by smallpox. He was severely injured when he was hit by a carriage, leaving his left arm slightly paralyzed the rest of his life. He attended the seminary before becoming a Marxist revolutionary and editing the party's newspaper, Pravda. I tried saying that fast. He was essentially a gangster and a thug. He raised funds for the Bolsheviks via train robberies, kidnappings, and protection rackets. He eliminated his opponents through intrigue or outright assassination. He created a cult of personality around himself. He could not stand people who disagreed with him. He probably killed upwards of 50 million people through his agricultural collectivization and rapid industrialization programs. He is the typical dictator, strongman who ruled Russia with a fist of steel. And that's what Stalin means, steel, man of steel. Joseph Vissarionovich Zhukashvili. Boy, that's a great name to say over and over again. Stalin. Okay, I've already said his biographical background. When he takes over in the Soviet Union, he undertakes a large number of these grandiose, over-the-top programs, such as you see like the windmill in animal farm, which I keep going back to over and over again. Collectivization of farms, industrialization, building industry rapidly. He engaged in a number of 5-year plans. Every time something went wrong, he would come out with another 5-year plan to reinvigorate the economy. He went after religion with a particular glee, especially Judaism. He tried to create a classless society, and to be honest, it meant that women had rights, minorities had rights in this. He called for mandatory education and health care. That's communism. Everybody shares the bad health care equally. And he had massive state control of the arts and literature, making sure that they were all doctrinaire and speaking good things about the revolution and communism. The Soviet foreign policy under Stalin was guided by what was known as the Comintern. That is the Communist International, to try and spread revolution. But Stalin's really not so much about spreading revolution. What he does want to do is re-engage the West. And one of the reasons why he wants to re-engage the West is that they have money in those countries that they can loan to the Soviet Union. And he needs to trade with those countries. The overwhelming fear that Stalin has, and many of his cadres have, is a resurgence of Germany. And they were not far wrong in being afraid. The post-war period saw the march of nationalism across the globe. Germany's empire had been brought down. The imperial house of Hohenzollern had been defeated and removed from the throne of Germany. Germany is now turned into a republic. It's called the Weimar Republic because the first parliament of that German republic met in the town of Weimar. It was a government that was influenced and controlled by conservatives. This is not a liberal democracy by a long stretch. There's a great deal of resentment by Weimar and the German people against Versailles because of its harsh terms. Weimar goes through several periods. From 1918 to 1923, it struggles. There's hyperinflation. There's political extremism. There were political murders. There were revolts. Twice the government was almost overthrown. But then in 1923, the Weimar Republic stabilized. It started to make money for Germany again. There was a sort of a renaissance culturally with works of art and literature that went with the Weimar period. And that all came tumbling down, though, in 1929. And that would be the last period of Weimar, 1929 until 1933, which we will get to. As the Treaty of Versailles stated, the German army could only be 100,000 men strong and could only be used to quell domestic rebellions. This meant that several million German soldiers were demobilized. However, many of these German units maintained themselves unofficially in what were called free corps. These are paramilitary groups that would train and meet and keep things together militarily so that Germany could be ready when the day came that they could start building their military again. The Ottoman Empire fell in 1919, and the nation of Turkey emerged out of this. This was the Turkish War of Independence that brought an end to the Ottoman Empire after 623 years of rule. Because of this nationalistic war of independence, there were plenty of non-Turks that were caught up in the fray. Even during the war, there was Armenia. The Armenian genocide that had begun during World War I continued on through the Turkish War of Independence. Only now the Turks are coming to grips with it, and because that's their idiot president Erdogan has been denying it right and left, people are obviously looking at it. The Republic of Turkey was created in 1923. Another aspect of nationalism is you only want people of your language and your cultural group. There are Greek communities that dated back to the time of Plato and Aristotle that lived along the western coast of Asia Minor. They were uprooted. More than 1.1 million Greeks were forced to cross the Aegean and move over to Greece. And another 300,000 Turks on the Greek side were forced to go back to Turkey. The man who brought Turkey together was a fellow by the name of Mustafa Kemal. He takes the name Ataturk, which means Father Turk or Chief Turk. He liberalizes Turkey in a number of ways, throwing aside Islamic law in favor of more liberal style of democracy. And of course, you've all read about this in your books, What Went Wrong. And there is the Chief Turk himself, Mustafa Kemal, known as Ataturk. Perhaps nowhere did nationalism shine more brightly than in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was now broken up. Emperor Karl had relinquished his political duties, although he had not renounced his throne. Nonetheless, the empire and the nations within say thanks but no thanks, and they end the Habsburg dynasty. The longest ruling house in Europe has now come to an end. Hungary separated on October the 17th, 1918. They came under the leadership of Miklos Horthy, an admiral in the Hungarian Navy. Czechoslovakia was created on October the 28th. Today it's now the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but it was one nation back then. There was a state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs on October the 29th. The biggest issue here is that these new borders became economic barriers. You all are reading a great deal about Brexit, I hope, and learning a great deal. And you know that one of the problems with the British exit from Brexit, British exit from the European Union, hence Brexit, is that there are now economic borders to cross. Before, you didn't need to cross any borders to get to Britain from France and so forth. Now you got to go through customs checks. And that's creating a problem for many in the British Empire who do not want to have borders to cross. Remember, go all the way back to the Peace of Westphalia and also the Napoleonic Age. This is what was envisioned for Europe, lack of economic barriers. And here you see economic barriers going up with these nations that are emerging out of the Austrian Empire. You had other lands also that were given to the Poles, the Italians, the Romanians, and the new state of Yugoslavia. Here you take a look at what used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire and what emerged out of this. The state of Austria itself is really not all that big of a region. It lost the Tyrol to Italy, it lost Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Galicia, and Transylvania gets sent over to the Romanians. That's where Dracula is from. You have the states of the Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. That's going to become part of later Yugoslavia and so forth. And by the rule of the Treaty of Versailles, Austria could not join with Germany, even though it was a German-speaking nation. And so Vienna becomes an imperial capital without an empire. Well, you knew it had to come eventually. You know it, you love it, you can't live without it. Let's talk about the Irish. From April 24th to April 30th, 1916, as soldiers were dying along the Western Front, the Irish nation rose up in what was known as the Easter Rising. This was a failed attempt to declare an Irish republic. As a matter of fact, when the Easter Rising took place, very few Irish in the city of Dublin really knew or cared what was going on. Several men declared an Irish republic, tried to seize several of the government buildings in downtown Dublin. Eventually, British troops were brought in. The rebellion was put down. The 7 leaders who declared the Irish republic were arrested. They were put in jail and they were executed. And it was at that moment when the British executed the revolutionaries. that the real Irish Rebellion began. The British sent over to join the Royal Irish Constabulary a group of former soldiers, and they called them the Black and Tans because of their clothing. They had a reputation for brutality about them. The Irish Republican Army, which fought against the Black and Tans, retaliated in 1921 by assassinating Sir Henry Wilson, who had been one of the chief generals of the First World War. Shot him to death on his own doorstep, which was a clarion call to the British government that they could get and reach the highest levels. Eventually, because the people rose up at the brutality of the Black and Tans and the treatment of the revolutionaries, a very unsatisfactory settlement was reached. In 1922, the Irish Free State was created. This would be the 26 counties of the South. They would be nominally part of the British Empire. They were not allowed to have a navy. They were allowed to have an army. They were supposedly under the Commonwealth. The Irish said, you can call us whatever you want, we're free. But the 6 counties of Ulster that we call Northern Ireland today, which is where people like Liam Neeson and Roy McIlroy are from, they remained within the British sphere because the 6 counties of Ulster, the Irish up there are Protestants, not Roman Catholics, and they identify more as British. This unsatisfactory settlement resulted in the Irish Civil War of 1922 to 1923. Eventually, 2 of the great revolutionaries during the Irish Rebellion, Eamon de Valera, who was born Edward de Valera in New York City, but his mother was Irish and he moved back over to Ireland as a young man, eventually seized control of Ireland. During the war, his close associate, Michael Collins, the man who had assassinated Sir Henry Williams, now takes over the army of the Irish Free State. During the Civil War, he was shot in the head and killed at the age of 32. De Valera was known as the chief. Michael Collins was known as the big fella. Their split really split Ireland. De Valera would live all the way into the 1970s, but Michael Collins is the one who is revered to this day in Ireland. Here are the 7 men who made the proclamation with the full knowledge that they were probably going to fail and that they would die, and yet they threw themselves on the altar of Irish freedom. Top row, left to right, Thomas Clark, who is the chief organizer of this rebellion, Sean McDermott, Patrick Pearse, and Joseph Mary Plunkett. The bottom row, left to right, is Thomas MacDonagh, Eamon Kent, and James Connolly, who was the one Marxist among the group. This is their proclamation. Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland through us summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. Having organized and trained her manhood through her secret revolutionary organization, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and through her open military organizations, the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army, having patiently perfected her discipline, having resolutely waited for the right moment to reveal itself, she now seizes that moment, and supported by her exiled children in America and by gallant allies in Europe, but relying in the first on her own strength, she strikes in full confidence of victory. We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies to be sovereign and indefeasible. The long usurpation of that right by a foreign people and government has not extinguished the right, nor can it ever be extinguished except by the destruction of the Irish people. In every generation, the Irish people have asserted their right to national freedom and sovereignty. 6 times during the past 300 years, they have asserted it in arms. Standing on that fundamental right and again asserting it in the arms of the face of the world, we hereby proclaim the Irish Republic as a sovereign, independent state, and we pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms to the cause of its freedom, of its welfare, and of its exaltation among the nations. The Irish Republic is entitled to and hereby claims the allegiance of every Irishman and Irishwoman. The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens, and declares its resolve to pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation of all its parts, cherishing all of the children of the nation equally, and oblivious of the differences carefully fostered by an alien government, which have divided a minority from the majority in the past. Until our arms have brought the opportune moment for the establishment of a permanent national government, representative of the whole people of Ireland and elected by the suffrages of all her men and women, the provisional government hereby constituted will administer the civil and military affairs of the Republic in trust for the people. We place the cause of the Irish Republic under the protection of the Most High God, whose blessing we invoke upon our arms, and we pray that no one who serves that cause will dishonor it by cowardice, inhumanity, or rapine. In this supreme hour, the Irish nation must, by its valor and discipline, and by the readiness of its children to sacrifice themselves for the common good, prove itself worthy of the august destiny to which it is called. Signed on behalf of the Provisional Government, Thomas J. Clark, Sean McDermott, Thomas McDonough, P.H. Pierce, Eamon Kent, James Connolly, Joseph Plunkett. There's Eamon de Valera on the left and Michael Collins on the right. In the movie Michael Collins, de Valera was played by the late Alan Rickman, and Michael Collins was played by Liam Neeson. So this, you see, is a map of Ireland. The 26 counties of the South are now called the Republic of Ireland. That was created in 1937, but in 1922 it was called the Irish Free State. And there you see the 6 counties of the north: Fermanagh, Tyrone, Derry, not Londonderry, don't ever call it that, Antrim, Down, and Armagh. Those counties remain within the British Union, but these days it's a very troubled existence. Not so much because of the violence, which has largely gone away, although there are still some vestiges of it. It's mostly because of the border between Northern Ireland, or Ulster as it should be called, and the rest of Ireland in the south, the Republic. Because the question is, will that be a hard border, which means economics, customs, and so forth, or will it be a soft border where there are no customs checkpoints? And one of the true ironies of nationalism, and I dare say even a hypocrisy of nationalism, is that oftentimes those who lead nationalistic charges will pick and choose exactly who is worthy of being included in the nation, despite the fact that they are enculturated completely, they speak the language, they follow the customs, they just happen to have a different religion, such as the Jews. The Jews are the ones on the outside looking in during these nationalistic upsurges. European Jews, or as we call it, European Jewry, were more and more distrusted and oppressed. Throughout Europe, they were associated with the Bolshevik movement. After all, Trotsky himself was a Jew. And that is true. There were many Jews who were Bolsheviks. And yet at the same time, the Bolsheviks are going to turn around and put them under a great deal of scrutiny. The Germans, of course, found an easy scapegoat in the Jews. Anti-Semitism had been running for quite a while in the Germanic countries. Vienna was a center of anti-Semitism. Another big center of anti-Semitism was Munich. And Russia was one of the worst perpetrators of anti-Semitism. Several Jewish communities, especially those in the Caucasus region, trace their origins from the time of the Jewish exile, 586 years before Christ. These Jewish communities moved into the Caucasus regions when they left Palestine. Many of the Cossacks, or we call the Kazakhs, that's Borat's people, they purged the Jews, either threw them out or killed them. And the communists throughout kept a very close eye on all Soviet Jews. Now, as I said, after the Dreyfus affair, many Jews begin to embrace Zionism. want to return to a Jewish homeland, and of course that means Palestine. What was known as the first Aliyah from 1881 to 1903 was the first wave of immigration to Palestine. These were agricultural people who happened to be Jews. They begin to buy farms or buy land and create farms, the collective farms known as the kibbutzes. The second Aliyah takes place from 1904 to 1914. There, in the British Mandate of Palestine, they begin to organize themselves. They even create a security force called the Haganah. This is a Hebrew paramilitary group. Nationalism continued on. Despite the objections of T.E. Lawrence, a famous British soldier we'll talk about in just a moment, the Middle East was partitioned between the British and the French, and new nations were carved out. Britain took Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, and Palestine. France took Syria and Lebanon. In Saudi Arabia, the family of Ibn al-Saud, who you see there in the photograph, becomes the ruling house of Saudi Arabia, the member of the royal family now that runs Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarchy, still to this day. There are also movements of independence and nationalism through Africa. John Chilembwe leads a revolution in Malawi, which is down in the southeastern portion of Africa. He was a Baptist preacher. He tried to lead a colonial uprising during the war that failed, but he did leave a revolutionary legacy. Muhammad Abd al-Krim was a Moroccan leader who organized the tribes against the French and the Spanish in Morocco. He was one of those that started using tunnels in warfare. Further south, you had Pan-Africanism. This was led by a number of people, including Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican-born revolutionary. He loved to go around with a Napoleon style of hat. Pan-Africanism was a worldwide movement that aimed to encourage and strengthen bonds of solidarity between all indigenous and diaspora, that is, people spread out, ethnic groups of African descent. Garvey's style of Pan-Africanism sought economic opportunities. Now, his controversy was advocating black separation. He, at times, worked with the Ku Klux Klan in the United States to achieve black separatism. He said, let the whites congregate with the whites and we'll congregate with each other. South of the border, the United States had to deal with the Mexican Revolution that was still going on. In the 1920s and the 1930s, Mexico underwent a number of revolutions, which were actually a series of revolutions between the 20s and 30s. These were largely against the elites and the large landowners. At times, the Communist Party got a good hold of Mexico, and many priests were persecuted this way. It is told very well in Graham Greene's story, The Power and the Glory. You had Mexican revolutionaries like Pancho Villa, who led the U.S. on a wild goose chase prior to the First World War, and Emiliano Zapata, another great revolutionary of Mexico. I did not really cover too much of the First World War in the Middle East, and there were some significant battles there, battles in places like Nazareth and Jerusalem and so forth. But I highly recommend that you watch the magnificent epic movie Lawrence of Arabia, starring Peter O'Toole, Alec, Obi-Wan Kenobi Guinness, Jack Hawkins, Anthony Quinn, Omar Sharif, Anthony Quayle, Claude Rains, and Arthur Kennedy. The movie centers on the figure of Thomas Edward Lawrence, known as T.E. Lawrence or Lawrence of Arabia, who was a British archaeologist, an army officer, a diplomat, and a writer. He became renowned for his role in the Arab Revolt of 1916 to 1918 against the Ottoman Empire, the Sinai and Palestine campaigns of 1915 through 1918 that also sought to defeat the Ottoman Empire and bring it down. After the First World War, Lawrence joined the British Foreign Office. He worked with the British government and he worked with several of the Arab leaders. In 1922, he basically threw his hands up with life. He retreated from public life and spent the years until 1935 serving under an assumed name as an enlisted man in the Royal Air Force with a brief period in the Army. During this time, he published his best-known work, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, which was an autobiographical account of his participation in the Arab Revolt. He also translated books into English and wrote The Mint, which detailed his time in the Royal Air Force working as an ordinary aircraft man. So he saw, perhaps most intimately, the situation in the Middle East and the situation in the Arab world and how complex it really was. We won't really know what he would have gone on to do because in 1935 he was tragically killed in a motorcycle accident. There you see him in his British Army uniform, and on the right you see Lawrence dressed up as an Arab sheikh. On the left you see John Chilembwe with his family. Although he was a Baptist preacher, he could be quite violent. He attacked a British plantation owner, cut off his head, and paraded his head around with a stake, trying to get the people to rally to him. They didn't quite go for it. On the right, you see Marcus Garvey wearing his famous Napoleonic-style hat. On the left, you see Pancho Villa without his customary sombrero. He actually dressed down a little bit when he was in the United States for a time. On the right, you see Emiliano Zapata in his great sombrero. This is an interesting picture of Pancho Villa, who is second from the right. At the far right is Peppino Garibaldi, who is the grandson of the great Italian revolutionary. The second most populous nation in the world, India at the time, had been a British territorial possession since the rebellion of the sepoys back in 1857. But now at last, Indian nationalism was beginning to awaken. They were led by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Gandhi lived both in India and South Africa. He studied law in London. It is he who begins the great campaign against the British, preaching nonviolence. He preached satyagraha, passive disobedience, and ahimsa, nonviolence. He comes to be known as the Mahatma, or the Great Soul. He forms the Indian National Congress and calls for mass strikes and protest marches. He calls for people to walk patiently up to the salt works, which was one of the most lucrative British operations, and receive beatings on the head to show that they were willing to do anything to get their independence. But Gandhi was always careful to call off a strike whenever they became violent. Gandhi sought to overturn the caste system in India. He said untouchables must be brought in, no more Brahmins, and so forth. Born and raised to a Hindu family and raised as a Hindu, Gandhi trained in law at the Inner Temple, London, and became a lawyer at the age of 22 in 1891. When he was traveling on a train in South Africa, despite the fact that he had purchased a first-class ticket, he was sitting in a whites-only car and was thrown out at the next train station. He was not able to start a law practice in India, so he moved to South Africa in 1893 to represent an Indian merchant in a lawsuit, and he would stay in South Africa for 21 years. It's here that he raised his family and began his nonviolent campaign for civil rights. In 1915, at the age of 45, he returned to India and began organizing peasants, farmers, urban laborers to protest against the land tax and the discrimination of the British Empire. He became leader of the Indian National Congress in 1921. He led nationwide campaigns for easing poverty, expanding the rights of women, building religious and ethnic amity. He was one of those who had blossomed under religious syncretism, where the Hindu priest would preach from the Quran as much as he would preach from the Vedas. He wanted self-rule more than anything else. In 1921, Gandhi also adopted the use of an Indian loincloth and a shawl in the winter that was woven with yarn that was hand spun on a traditional Indian spinning wheel, which now, the charkha, the Indian spinning wheel, now is on the flag of India. This is his sign of identification with India's rural poor. He lived modestly, a self-sufficient residential community. He ate simple vegetarian food. He undertook long fasts as a means of self-purification and political protest against violence. He led the charge against the salt tax. He was imprisoned many times and for many years, both in South Africa and India. We shall return later to the Mahatma, or the Great Soul as he was known. Despite the fact that the war was over, it was still very much on the minds of many people. There was an almost frantic desire to see something like the First World War never happen again. But the British retreated from continental affairs, choosing instead to focus on their overseas empire and quell the problems that were arising in South Africa and India and other places. The French were unable to enforce the peace alone and became very vindictive as a result. But Germany was admitted to the League of Nations in 1922, and this begins the quest for international peace. The Locarno Pact, which is actually a series of treaties, normalized relations between Germany and the rest of Europe. In Washington, D.C. in 1922, you had a naval conference that resulted in three major treaties. The Four-Power Treaty, which kept the status quo in the Pacific, and the Five-Power Treaty, or the Washington Naval Treaty, was the one in which the major powers would settle the number of battleships and capital ships that they could put into their navies. You had a nine-power treaty and a number of smaller agreements. Once again, the Japanese, who were not allowed to have the largest nation in the world, that was for the United States and Britain, left this conference feeling that they had been shorted again by the West. And as I have said, the Japanese have long memories. In 1928, French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand, who had once served as Prime Minister of France, and United States Secretary of State under Herbert Hoover, under Calvin Coolidge, Frank Kellogg of the famous Kellogg cereal family, yes. They got together and signed a treaty called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It outlawed war as a means of settling political disputes. Yay, war is outlawed. Did it work? Of course it didn't work. However, and this is the big however, the Kellogg-Briand Pact set up the principles of international law, and this would be used after World War II. For the United States, it was isolationism. We didn't want to have anything to do anymore with the goings-on in Europe. President Warren G. Harding was elected in 1920 on a campaign of, we're going to restore America to normalcy. We're going to go back to doing big business and making big things and making a lot of money and not worrying about what's going on over in Europe. And even though he died in office under a scandal, his successor, Calvin Coolidge, followed along with that as well, as did his successor as well, Herbert Hoover. Here is one of the famous pictures from the Washington Naval Conference. On the right is Curtis Wilbur, the United States Secretary of the Navy. He is sitting for a picture with a friend of his, a member of the Japanese Imperial Naval Staff. His name is Captain Yamamoto Isoroku. The two men liked each other. Yamamoto was very fond of the United States. He had studied at Harvard for a time, traveled the country, saw how great it was, Nonetheless, he was a committed Japanese nationalist to the core, and for Japan in all things, and he was not happy with the Washington Naval Conference. Later on, Yamamoto, despite his great admiration for the United States, would plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. Here is an example of how the Washington Naval Conference worked. The Japanese were building a battleship named Akagi. Well, under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty, this battleship would have put Japan over the limit of battleships. So what did they do? They converted it to an aircraft carrier. In 1942, United States Navy pilots would sink it at the Battle of Midway. The victorious Allies, as I've already pointed out, showed a reluctance to take part in the peace or enforce the peace, and had problems of their own. The United States had retreated back to itself and was now embroiled in the Roaring Twenties. When I speak about the Roaring Twenties, we speak about the return to big business under the policy of normalcy. There was also a major Red Scare in the United States as the new Soviet Communist government grew. Many in the United States became almost apoplectic about the threat of Bolshevik contamination in the United States. There is a period of upsurge in racism. A new Ku Klux Klan emerges in the northern United States. As a matter of fact, in July of 1927, 6 members of the New York Ku Klux Klan were arrested for violently starting a riot. One of those 6 men was named Frederick Trumpf. He had an interesting son. For Britain and France, there was a great resistance to reform at this time, especially when it came to their colonies, and they were losing colonial markets. The other big worry that the French had, more even than the British, because the British had the English Channel, was yet another invasion from Germany. The French now begin to build a massive defense line along the border between Germany and France. It is called the Maginot Line. It's a long series of barbed wire, reinforcement bunkers, fortresses, and so forth that were designed to keep the Germans out of France. There was one problem with the Maginot Line. It stopped at Belgium. Where did the Germans come again during World War I? They came through Belgium. Now, the period of 1925 to 1928 was a period of slight recovery and prosperity. I already said that the Weimar government in Germany showed signs of life. The governments in Britain and France were also doing pretty well. The United States has let the good times roll, but there were problems underneath the surface. The post-war world was a very precarious world when it came to finances and economies. And that would definitely come tumbling down at a point. As an example of how precarious the financial situation was, I give you these 4 men. In the upper left is Benjamin Strong, Jr. of the New York Federal Reserve, the Fed. Top center, Montague Norman of the Bank of England. Top right, Emile Moreau of the Banque de France. And at the bottom center is Hjalmar Schacht of the Reichsbank. These 4 men got together in 1927 very secretly and conspired to return Europe to the gold standard to stabilize the economy. Strong insisted on cutting the Fed's discount rate at 0.5% in 1927, and this made Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover furious. By cutting the Fed discount rate at 0.5%, a market bubble was created. And when the bubble burst in 1929, the market collapsed. The most populous nation on earth was now putting aside more than 2 millennia of imperial rule. The last emperor of the Qing dynasty was Pu Yi, and I mentioned him way back when we studied about the Manchurians and the Qing dynasty. Pu Yi actually became emperor when he had already been overthrown. Not that he wasn't emperor anymore, it's just that he didn't have any rule. He only ruled within the imperial city. The rest of China was under the leadership of a republic led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen and his nationalist political party called the Kuomintang, or the Kuomintang. Dr. Sun Yat-sen followed the three principles that he set down for rule in China: nationalism, the independence of China; democracy, the proper rule of China; and social reform. That is, making sure that China was up to date and able to be just to all of its people. Dr. Sun Yat-sen died of gallbladder cancer in 1925. He was succeeded by his understudy, Jiang Jieshi, who we referred to at one time as Chiang Kai-shek. The nationalist government attempts to bring together the disparate peoples of the most populous nation on earth, but it has many outside and inside forces working against it. First, the rise of Japan. Japan is seeking to become the preeminent power in the Pacific region. Now, the Chinese don't have the organization or the economy to achieve this yet, but at the same time, they are going to try and resist the Japanese attempts to become the top dog. The other problem, of course, is communism. Mao Zedong, also known as Mao Zedong, was the leader of the Chinese communists. And they are the ones that are pushing very hard among the Chinese peasant population to throw off both the yoke of the old Qing dynasty, but also the yoke of the Kuomintang, who they said were nothing more than tools of the West. On the left is Puyi, last emperor of the Qing dynasty, last emperor of all China. Even before he came to the throne, the Qings had been essentially deposed as the rulers of China. And on the right, you see Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who is the leader of nationalist China. Here you see the two longtime opponents in China. On the left is Jiang Jieshi. He is the successor to Sun Yat-sen as leader of the Kuomintang. He will lead China from 1925 until 1949, and then he will lead Taiwan until his death in the 1970s. On the right is Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese communists, who would fight Jiang Jieshi and the nationalists until their victory in 1949, creating the People's Republic of China, and Mao would be the ruler of China until 1976.